Hey, my father, he was a teacher for 30 years, public school teacher for 30 years, but he's been a teacher his whole life. And when he wasn't teaching the general public, school kids about things like business and typing and weightlifting and track and field and football and whatnot, he was teaching me about life away from the city. And I've attended his courses my whole life, and I still do. So my classroom with him wasn't your normal classroom. My classroom was the wilderness. And my education took place in the deserts and mountains of Arizona, depending on the season. And yes, we do have mountains here in Arizona, and they can get quite high. We get 10,000 plus feet, all the way down to 2,000 in the desert. But unless it was necessary to do so, the desert education would generally take place in the winter, when it was cooler in the desert and we could go out and do certain things. And then in the summers, we would try to escape the heat of the desert and go up north into the mountains. And as a teacher, my dad had summers off from work, so he was able to. We were able to go up for weeks or months at a time during the summer and camp and fish for many weeks at a time. So between the ages of 3 and 4 years old until I was 9 or 10, being the oldest child, I was able to go up with him and a friend of his and his friend's son, and I learned a lot of things. When my siblings came along a little bit later than me, we started going to a lake, and it became, to me, more civilized because we were around more people, and even though it really wasn't that way. But when I was young, I have great memories of my dad and his buddy Bill and his son Mark and myself going up to the Indian reservations up in northeastern Arizona, where we made camp for weeks and months at a time in a special little place that we had that was off a little creek off the East Fork of the White River. And it was a way there was no campgrounds around. It was just a little place that we'd found, and we were allowed to stay there by the Indians because my father knew somebody who knew somebody in the tribe, and we weren't bothered there. So it was a great place, and it was really beautiful. I had some great summers up there. So my father's buddy Bill, his coaching and teaching buddy, and his son Mark, who I spent so much of my youth with, and who unfortunately passed away very young as an adult. That's where we grew up. It's been our childhood up there, learning about things and learning about lessons of survival in the wilderness, respect for the flora and the fauna of nature, understanding other cultures, not my own, particularly the Native Americans, and really developing the closeness to the land that I feel and that I've carried my whole life. And not that I have a dislike for big cities, but it's really nice to be able to go out and get away and understand what's going on there and be comfortable and unafraid of what you're doing. So this story called Chilled Wine is a story of a trip where I learned one of my father's most valued tenets. And one of his cardinal rules in camp is to leave it cleaner than we found it. Leave nothing but our footprints. It's probably something that's been heard since then many times, but that's the way it was. And I also learned about taking responsibility, being aware, getting some morality. So even only 7 or 8 years old, I knew the rule, and we always policed our area before we left, picking up anything that was foreign or even stuff that was there before we got there. But at this time, and in my youth, later on, I realized the concept of other people's littering and awareness didn't quite occur to me at that time. So on this trip, the 4 of us, the 2 adults and us 2 kids, we traveled to 220 miles or so from Phoenix to our favorite camping spot, and which was not a campground, but a special little spot we found away from others, right on a nice trout stream. And we traveled, and my dad had a small green Toyota Land Cruiser, one of the first Toyota Land Cruisers there was, and it was just a small little thing, about the size of a Jeep. And thinking back on it, I can't believe that we traveled that far and camped as long as we did, and hauled enough stuff to camp that long, with having 2 adults and 2 kids plus all the gear in this tiny little thing, and but we did, and that was actually an improvement from what we used to use, which he had a Volkswagen Bug, a Beetle that he'd bought in Germany and brought back, of all things. But so we did, and we even stayed inside this one small tent the entire time too, the four of us. Or sometimes the adults would sleep outside on the ground if the weather was reasonable, because as children we were still kind of afraid to do that. So our intended lesson, we always had an intended lesson for the trip, and our intended lesson for that trip was to learn how to find our way back to camp after dark. Because in the years before we had learned about, getting through the woods and getting through things during the day and checking landmarks and doing certain sorts of things. So this trip we were learning that at night. So we were being taught to recognize the landmarks, the direction the stream ran, the judging of the sun's directions, especially in the tall pine trees, which can be get kind of confusing. It's almost like clouds when you can't really see the landmarks, and it's easy to misjudge and estimate distances and direction. So that night we were taken out of camp. We were blindfolded. We were zigzagged around for some period of time, and then we stopped at a certain point next to the creek, and they took off our blindfolds. We were given flashlights and then told to count to 200 before we turned them on and make our way back to camp. And boy, were we scared. I mean, this was a scary, scary deal for us. So I got my friend calmed down, and we talked about things. Said, well, here's the river, and this way it's flowing, and this and that. And, so I kind of figured, well, we got to go this way. We got to go upstream, because I can, kind of feel we went downstream. And then we started noticing things and smelling things and hearing things that we didn't normally during the day. So we started smelling the campfire, and we started hearing where things were, and the other senses kind of took over, and it was kind of neat. And I can remember this even being that young, especially at night when sounds can be heard for a long way in the middle of nowhere, especially when you're really focusing on things. So we made our way back to camp, and we got the congratulations, and we passed that part of the thing. And I guess if we'd have been in the Boy Scouts, we'd have got our little badge, but we didn't. But the chilled wine story, I guess, begins now. Sorry about all the intro, but sometime during that next week or two, we learned another unintended, but probably just as important of a lesson. And we used to get up and, this was our area. We prowled our domain. This was our forest. This was our river. This was our stream. And we began to feel as if we owned it, as if this was our kingdom, our area. And we guarded it against wild beasts and foes and intruders with our BB guns. And we fished it to bring our dinner to our camp, and we fought the bats off that were flying crazily around our campfires at dusk. And it was just kids being kids, and our imaginations were going wild with this. And we patrolled our little kingdom. We knew every little changes in the rivers. We knew when it was up or down. We knew where the fish were. We knew what was going on. So one day we were making our rounds, and we were going up and down our river, doing our stuff in the morning, and we noticed a few green bottles that were in the stream near our camp. And they were under the water. They were sitting near the bank, under the water, in a calm area, so they couldn't be washed away. And so we immediately began discussing what were these? How could they have been there? And back then, it was on the Indian reservation, and there was preconceptions about Indians and drinking and such. And they did travel up and down. The only people we saw were the Indians, and they traveled up and down the river there, fishing for themselves, and also, doing some drinking and littering and stuff. So at that time, even as 7-8-year-olds, we had some conceptions and notions about that already. So we were kind of hacked off a little bit, going, what are they doing to our river, and and our fishing, and discarding the litter in our kingdom and our stuff. So this upset us quite mightily, and we decided what to do about it. So of all the nerve, being the good soldiers we were, we loaded up our BB guns, and we promptly began shooting those bottles, those enemies, right in the river, right through the water, watching the holes appear with satisfaction right in the glass. And after we killed that threat, we smugly went on our way, and of course we left the bottles right where they were. Not even understanding the whole concept of what we've been taught. So we went on our patrol, went down our way, and after we were done, we sauntered back to camp, and we traded in our firepower, put our big rifle, little BB guns away, and got our fishing poles. And we went to head out fishing. And we saw our fathers, napping out in the afternoon. And of course, we couldn't understand, how could you be napping out there on such a fine afternoon? There's so much exploring and fishing and such to do. So, anyway, that was their vacation, not ours. That was a whole different thing. But so we'd been out all day, and around sundown, when it's time for us to come back, we began our trek back to our fortress, our one camp and our one tent and our one table, and following the rules and the paths and everything we'd learned and set up over the years, and our little landmarks, our little notices and things we put up, and even some of the lessons we'd learned the nights prior. And as we rounded around a small bend just prior to camp, we heard a big roar, and we stopped in our tracks. And we were thinking, is that a bear? Because we thought we'd heard bears tromping through the creeks at night, but no, it wasn't a bear. It couldn't be the bears too early. Mountain lion? No, mountain lions scream. They don't roar like that. Or wolf? No, wolves don't. They bark and howl. They're not gonna. But it was a roar from. It ended up being a roar from the most frightening being known to me, and that was my dad. And so Mark and I both dropped our fishing poles, as well as our jaws, and we saw my dad holding up 2 jugs of wine bottles by their handles. And they were dripping, but liquids of some sort were shooting out of these holes from the sides of the bottles, out in a stream. And it was kind of artistic, now that I think back about it, but it wasn't too artistic at the time. So these holes in these bottles were created when we peppered these nuisances with our BB guns and assured ourselves they would not be a threat to our camp any longer. And our first thought was, why is he so angry? What do? We just shot up these old empty green bottles in the creek. So Dad yells, "Who did this?" And we both looked at each other, Mark and I, and started shaking. And then we both just started pointing at one another at the same time. "He did!" We both said at the same time, "He did it!" Well, needless to say, that is where our unintended lesson began. And after berating us about the dangers of shooting into water, shooting at water, shooting near water, shooting at things in water, he finally asked us, why in the world would we shoot their bottles of wine? And we responded, we didn't know they were our bottles or your bottles. We thought they were chunked in there by some Indians. So that got us another sit down, and which told us gave us another lesson about judging people by their actions, judging whole people by the actions of a few, and of course being punctuated by Dad's cardinal rule. Leave the camp cleaner than we found it. Leave nothing but our footprints. And that meant exactly what he said, cleaner than we found, regardless of who left it, who left what, or when it was left, or what was left, or for what reason. And certainly I learned just because it was in the creek, underwater, was not a reason to think that this rule did not apply. So it wasn't until years later also that I realized that for people who like to have a happy hour cocktail or two, especially out camping on your vacation, on your time off, and you're out in the wilderness and there's not a store for hours around, and you got a week or two supply of some wine in the creek being chilled, and then it's shot up by a couple of 8-year-olds. Well, I guess it could have been worse for us, but everybody seemed to get by all right. So, of course, after that trip and the many others, I've grown, continued to fish in camp. I've learned lessons, many, many lessons over the years, taught them to my kids, to others, to friends, to siblings, and I've always policed my campsites, left them cleaner than I found them, even though it gets harder and harder because there's just more and more disrespect by people out there. But I do what I can, and these are one of the many lessons that I've learned that I will never forget. And when my father's gone, I know his wisdom and legacy will continue on through the many, many stories, such as this one, that can continue to be talked about, will be talked about. We still laugh about them. We still discuss them at the campfire. So anybody new comes along, it's just got to rub off on them, and they're going to learn from this type of thing too. And so, thanks, Dad. And I just had to throw this in, a little shout out to my dad's best dog way back in the day, old Duke. Put a picture of him on there. And he mostly went along on our desert trips and our bird hunting trips. And I just couldn't avoid putting this pic into the slideshow because I still don't know exactly how this dog got himself in that position with his head through the toilet, but I thought it was kind of hilarious. So, 50-year-old picture, hilarious, and that's my story. And thanks for listening. Bye. The end.